want to remember, and as I go through this, I'm going to kind of highlight some things and erase it just so that we can address everything they could ask you about the monopoly. So remember, and you guys will know better than I will because you've taken the online macro. But this says the market for Woogle. So during the year, I was really kind of strict with, I want the quantity of Woogles. I want to know what this item is. And every graph that I give you, it says bushels of corn, tickets, there's always what it is. Up here, we always want to write the word price because we don't want to get that P confused with one of our other labels. Now, when they just talk about a monopoly, it is assumed to be single priced. And it's not a straight line, but I'm not redoing it. Somebody had asked me, what is this difference between single priced and the perfect price discriminator? And that's really important. So if they don't say anything and they just say they're a monopoly, you're to assume it's a single priced monopoly. And all that means is that they're going to charge everybody the same exact price, right? Now, this first part, you guys saw me draw. Sorry about that. You saw me do this in class today. So hopefully this part is not throwing anybody. I'm still having a little bit of problem. They're not going to be really picky about that, Lucy. Technically speaking, the marginal revenue of the first unit you sell and the price are the same, but they're not going to count off if you don't. I don't even look at it. And I've graded these before. I'm not even looking at if they're connected or not connected. I don't look at how steep or shallow you guys draw it. I'm just looking literally that the marginal revenue is below the demand. I don't like them to be parallel, but on the AP exam, they don't care. They just want the marginal revenue below. Now, the second thing that you want to make sure is that, and this is going to be hard because if they give you the picture of the graph, you're going to have to ignore some of the lines. So my suggestion is draw it for yourself and look at how you're drawing it. Everyone that showed me, you guys all got this quantity. So draw it yourself and then kind of do a compare and contrast. We never draw anything horizontally from this point. We go up and over for the price, okay? Now, most monopolies have an economic profit. So we're gonna put our average total cost below it. There's no need for me to put the average variable cost, but I could, I don't need it. So this is all I wanted you guys to draw. Some of you guys were adding some other things, which we did in class today. We put in the total economic profit. So this drew up some questions when they give you a picture. Again, draw it yourself and then try to compare and contrast. We already know the upper limit of our profit box is going to be where the price is. We're going to come down to where the ATC crosses my quantity, and that's going to be my lower bound. So all of this right here is going to be the economic profit, right? Now, as we look at the monopoly, what are some other questions they can ask you? Lucy had this on her graph. What's the deadweight loss? Well, what I want to remind you guys is the last FRQ that I just went over, you guys did on Thursday and Friday, asked you about eliminating the deadweight loss. So knowing this quantity right here coming down, I'm going to call that QSO for socially optimal. Get that in there because that's where your deadweight loss should point.
Are they good?
So I'm going to start, and we always start from the quantity that's being produced, and then we shade towards that socially optimal point. All right. There's one more point that they may ask you to label. This always gets me. I don't know why they ask it, because firms are not revenue maximizers, they're profit maximizers. But they do like to ask the question, where would this firm maximize their revenue? That is right here. I'm going to call that QR. So I'll put a little key down here. That QR is the revenue maximizing quantity. Do I need to label the QM and the QSO? Do you guys know what QSO means? Okay. All right, I'm going to give you a minute because I just thought of another one. Mine's going to be pretty bad. At what quantity will the firm break even? At what quantity will the firm break even? Break even. Good. So break even is when the price is equal to the ATC, and the price comes from demand. So I'm going to come right here. I'm using my straight line tool because I knew it was going to come close to that. No idea why that line just went in both directions. And I'm going to star that. And that is the break even quantity. That's everything about the graph. Now, there are some other questions they can ask you guys. I don't want to ask the perfect price discriminator right now. I'll do another, like I'll redo the graph and we can address it at that point. But I don't want to get this with too much information on it. Now, one other thing that they'll ask you is they'll ask you, what is the price elasticity of demand at any one of those quantities? All right. And that's when you're looking at your marginal revenue curve. So you're looking at the quantity and you can see that actually for the break-even quantity, the socially optimal quantity, and the profit maximizing quantity, do you see how all three of those quantities, the marginal revenue is positive? So that's the total revenue test, that when the price goes down, the change in revenue will be positive. So for all three of those, this would be, the demand would be price elastic. When you go to explain, you don't have to mention the total revenue test because you're actually using the graph. So you can simply say the demand is elastic because at that quantity, the marginal revenue is greater than 0, or the marginal revenue is positive. Can you guys think of anything else with the monopoly that we might need to address? Okay. I wanted to do this one because I didn't do it as clearly. I showed you the graph, but you guys didn't get a lot of practice with it. So in a monopoly, it's very rare that they tell you the monopoly has an economic profit. But when we get to monopolistically competitive, they may. So every one of you recognize that there's really not much difference in the demand for a monopolistically competitive. And the marginal revenue is below. Now you guys may notice I've drawn it slightly different, but we don't care in your graph that you know what the difference is. We just want a downward sloping demand curve with the marginal revenue below it. In a multiple choice question, or one that we got at in the FRQ that I went over in class yesterday and today, we do want you to know that the monopolistically competitive firm has a more elastic demand. So it would be a little bit flatter. We're still going to draw that marginal cost curve the same way. We're going to go to that marginal revenue equals marginal cost to get that quantity, and we're going to go up and over to get the price. Good there. Now, here's the hard part. Now, I don't know if you guys were looking when one of you first put it up, you guys had it at an economic loss. So in the monopolistically competitive, there are 3 different graphs they could ask you to draw. They could do economic profit, which is going to look just like this one. They could do economic loss, which means the average total cost curve would be above it. Now, this one, I would need both the average total cost and the average variable cost to show that they have a loss, but they would still produce. So here's where the hard part came in. I made the comment that in the long run, the competitive firms don't earn economic profit. So that means at this quantity, there should be 0 economic profit, which is when the price is equal to the average total cost. And at least 3 of you did draw that scenario, but what happens is it can't pass through. Your average total cost curve cannot, and I'm going to put this in blue, it can't cross through like that. Yes, that does show 0 economic profit. It just so happens that the way that the elasticity works and the way that firms enter and exit, the average total cost curve is actually tangent to the graph. Now, this is one where I'm really careful. Now, you guys are not going to have to draw this, but you're going to have to recognize it, right? So if, I would think that they might put a couple graphs up there and ask you, which one is long run equilibrium. They're going to have a graph just like some of you guys drew where it was going through. Now, this looks like it's not quite tangent, so I just make the dot bigger. But this is what we're looking for. We need that point right there to be tangent to the demand curve. All right. You can still find all the other information that we found in the monopoly. We can look to see where, the socially optimal quantity is, that allocatively efficient quantity. We can look at, where the revenue is maximized. And this obviously is where we have a break even. Questions about the monopolistically competitive? Okay. I'm going to go backwards here. We've already done one with a profit. So let's try the perfect competitor with a short run economic loss. Let's do the short run economic loss. And now we're going to do a loss. Now, really, I could do all 3 of those for a monopolistically competitive, and I could do all 3 for the perfect competitive. But the general idea is the same as long as you know the difference between, the firm's demand curve and marginal revenue. In the perfectly competitive, whether it's a resource market or a product market, we always have to have the market graph because that's where we get the price from. And the market graph is always just simply supply and demand. We come down and make that QM, the M is for market, and PM, making sure that you get to that intersection. They do look at that. So if by accident your price had been like up here, clearly not at that equilibrium, they would not give you the point. So be careful there. All of you had that horizontal demand equals marginal revenue, and this price should be the same. That they are equal. We need the marginal cost curve, and then I'm going to come down and I'm going to label as QF. Now, I don't know if you guys have noticed in every single graph that I've drawn on the firm, I always do the demand, the marginal revenue, and then the marginal cost. I do those three things first. I find the quantity, and then I'll go to the next. Look at that even if they give you the graph. Look for those three things first, and then go to the next step. So I have my profit maximizing quantity, and they want me to have a loss. So what that means, and I use reference points. So if I have a loss, that means that my price is going to be less than my ATC at the quantity. So I should say at QF. So I'm going to go up from the quantity, and I'm just going to put a reference point there. If it was a profit, I'd put a reference point down here. Now I know that I have to be at a minimum on the marginal cost curve. So now I can go ahead, and you know what? I don't always hit my point, but it gave me a reference, right? So I didn't exactly hit it, but it is still above. So there is my economic loss. Now, if you guys didn't hear me on several of your graphs, I said, okay, that's good. You have the ATC at the appropriate place, but without the AVC, we don't know if we're going to produce. So this is a graph where I've got to have, let's see, I've got to have this AVC in there. Okay. Now, again, the only difference between the profit, the loss, and our long run equilibrium is where this average total cost curve sits. Yes, it does. So Lucy just asked, does demand and marginal revenue in this case? You want to remember that demand always equals average revenue. So you will hear some people talk about Mr. DARP. They like to say that. Perfect competitors are very formal. So they say Mr. DARP. Now, I don't really teach this like when I'm teaching the course, because I don't like to see Mr. DARP written here. I want you to understand the Mr. DARP. And what this is telling you is that marginal revenue is equal to the demand, which is equal to the average revenue, which is equal to the price. Good afternoon, Kayla. So that's what the Mr. DARP is for, just to remind you that that horizontal line is all four of those. It is a really good double check on that. Yes, Camilla just asked, do you only need the average variable cost when there's an economic loss? And the answer is yes. If it's at long run equilibrium or there's an economic profit, there's no need for it. The only purpose of the average variable cost curve is to help determine whether the firm should shut down or continue to produce. Now, if I go back a page, I'm going to have to go back 2 pages. We talked about the formality of the perfect competitor, where the demand curve is thought of as Mr. DARP. Well, here in both of these markets, we just go with DARP. Very informal, just call him by his last name, DARP. He loves being called DARP because in this case, we know that the demand is equal to the average revenue, which is actually the price of the item. So that DARP piece comes in any market that you're drawing for the product market. It's just whether it's formal to be Mr., which gets that MR in there, or if it's informal. Okay. You're not going to see an oligopoly graph. They're going to ask about it, but they're not going to have you draw it, because it's either going to look exactly like one of these two, or it's going to be that kink demand curve. And they really save that from, they ask multiple choice questions about the kink demand curve, about that idea of following a price change or ignoring a price change. So they may ask that, but they won't ask you to draw the kink demand curve. So that brings us to our resource market. Do the perfectly competitive for me first. Everybody got that this was just the good old supply and demand. So we're going to come down here, and they will always tell you what to label these or, what to look for. QM and PM. Whoopsie, should not put P. This is a wage. So we should make this wage M. Now, everybody understood that there was going to be a horizontal line here. That's the whole purpose of having them side by side. So this would be wage M. Now, sometimes they're going to tell you that it's wage F. They'll put it up there and put wage M, wage F, because one of their questions is going to be, what's the relationship between WM and WF? And that's where they want you to say, oh, they're equal. Okay. So this is what happened on some of you guys. We have to remember that from the resource side, we are now supplying the resource of labor. So the horizontal is no longer demand. It's going to be the supply. Okay. Now, everybody who did this did understand that the supply was the marginal factor cost. I saw all of you guys have that. It was just whether you had the upward sloping supply curve or the horizontal. So try to remember for the factor market or resource market, we are the supply, right? So just do a quick check and say, okay, am I going to buy in this market or am I going to sell? If you're going to sell, you're going to be the supply. And if you're going to buy, you're going to be the demand. And it's a really quick way to do it because labor, are you going to go out and buy labor? Like, I mean, literally today, none of you guys own a business, do you? I get into trouble because sometimes I've had, some students who've owned their own business. So none of you guys own a business. So you're not going to hire anybody. You're not going to buy labor. You are going to supply it, right? And then we have the downward sloping demand curve. And what I saw some of you guys miss, which was my discussion on the marginals, is we need the marginal revenue product. No marginals over here because this is the market and they're not discussing an externality. This is the firm, and a firm always makes their decisions based off of marginals. So I have to have that present. And this right here would be the quantity that the firm will hire, right? Now, we had a discussion earlier when we were doing our little black book. What I want to remind you is that if we're in the market and it talks about, what is happening to the market wage, the market wage will be impacted by either the supply or demand in the market. So you're going to see things about resources that are substitutes or complements, or the one that we did yesterday or today when it talked about the insurance. Each worker was going to have to buy their own insurance. That was going to impact the market supply. That was not going to impact the firm directly. It impacted the market, and then the market wage is going to impact the firm. So never, if it's asking about what's happening to the wage that the firm will pay, make sure that you go back to the market to see what's going on in the market. Was it just, my firm that's going to demand more? Because if it's just my firm that's going to demand more, that's not going to impact the market wage. That's only going to impact this specific firms. Does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. Okay, so a couple pieces of feedback that I've gotten, like the resource market makes people very nervous. And I'm just sitting there thinking, after some feedback that I got from the macro, where the typical concepts that I said come up a lot, didn't come up as much. And international apparently came up a lot, more so than interest rate. So I'm sitting there thinking, the resource market is usually not, it's covered. And probably about 75% of the time it's in an FRQ, but it's usually more on the simple side. So this year I'm thinking and wondering, are they going to hit it a little bit harder? And it makes people nervous because we spend so much time on the product market. So I want to remind you guys that all the graphs I've taught you, they really do help you answer the questions. So if you can draw this graph for the perfect competitive firm in the resource market, you're going to be able to answer the questions. And you're going towards this MFC equals MRP. Again, try to remember that. Calculate your MFC and your MRP 90% of the time. This is just the wage. They're going to flat out give you what the MFC is, right? So draw these out and you're going to get your answer. Now, this is where I want to be careful. The last graph for today that I'm going to work on, and then I want to go over some multiple choice, is in the resource market, it's going to be the monopsony. And I know we just did it, but I want to do it again. What I want to remind you is the difference between the two market types, product and our resource, because the vocabulary you use is very similar, but you won't get points if you use it in the wrong market. This one I'm just going to graph with you guys because we did it in class today. So this would be the quantity of labor. Could be, hairdressers or electricians. And this is the one where they have the same demand equals marginal revenue product. They have their supply. And it's the opposite of your monopoly. In order for them in a monopsony to hire one more worker, they have to increase the wage for all of their workers. So that means that the marginal factor cost of hiring Kayla is actually going to be higher than her wage, because not only am I hiring her, but I have to add to Camilla's salary and Farisa's salary and Haley's salary and Hannah's salary and Audrey's and Lucy's, right? So that's why the marginal factor cost is above. We always go to MFC equals MRP, and we're going to come down, and that's our quantity, and we're going to go over, and that's our wage. I can compare this to the perfect competitive market because that's right here, supply and demand. This was on your MRP FRQ, and it is a very simple explanation as to why the monopsonist pays a lower wage. It's because the marginal factor cost is above you can call it the supply curve, you can call it the wage curve. Sometimes this is called a wage curve. Okay. Now, the one thing I want to do is I want to make sure that you know that terminology that's going to be different. So in the MRP FRQ, some were kind of making new terms up. Like they asked you to find the average fixed cost, and people were taking the fixed cost and dividing it by the labor. That would give you the fixed cost per worker, but that's not an average cost. So what I want to remind you, let me insert a page here, is I want you to know the vocabulary that's associated with the product market versus the resource market. And there is only one term or vocabulary, maybe I should say one set, that actually could be used in both the product and the resource market. So in the product market, you guys want to know that this is really about the quantity that's being sold. So this is where we have our marginal revenue, our marginal cost. I am going to use abbreviations here, so if you need me to write them out, just put it in the chat to please write them out. Okay, so let me pause for a second from this because I want to address something that came up in the chat, which is interesting. So it was stated, if I'm the only one who is employing, don't I have control over the wage? And the answer is slightly. It's the same way that the monopolist has control over the price that they charge. But ultimately speaking, it's you and I who get to choose that price. I, as the monopsonist, can't say, I'm going to pay you $2 an hour. You guys are going to say no. Even if I am the only employer, you're not going to accept it. You'll say, I'll make do some other way. Like I'll travel like 2 hours to get to work. I'm not going to accept a job for $2 an hour. So even though I'm the only employer, I may be able to impact that wage and pay you lower than if there were more employers. But ultimately speaking, you have the freedom to say, no, I'm not working. Now, that's where unions kind of come in really strongly because guess what? If I'm the only employer and every single one of you says, no, I'm not working for $2 an hour, which by the way, you should say that, then what am I going to have to do? Like all of my potential employees have just told me they're not going to work for me for $2 an hour. I'm going to have to pay a higher wage. And it's the same thing in the monopolist. The monopolist can't just charge me whatever they want. They can't say, well, you're going to have to pay $300 for this pen. I must don't need it that much. So we ultimately have the freedom to say, yes, we will work for that, or no, we won't. So the monopolist does control it a little bit, but ultimately speaking, we say yes or no, right? So the other words that go along with the product market besides our marginal revenue and our marginal cost are those averages: the average total cost, the average fixed cost, the average variable cost. Now, this thing that's important to remember here, which got people confused on, pardon me, the MRP FRQ, is this is all of these are divided by the quantity of the product. We talk about quantity in both the labor market and the product market. So you want to make sure you know if it's ever asking about an average cost, no matter what the cost, you want to know that you should be dividing by the quantity. Okay. Other words that come into play with the product market, I don't think you're going to have as much trouble with. Those would be your total cost and your total average cost. I'm sorry, total variable cost, total fixed cost. That makes sense that it's in the product market. So these are the big ones that you want to make sure that you understand. Over on the resource market, the marginal revenue sounds really close because it's the marginal revenue product. So these marginals are one additional unit sold or produced, right? So this says, how does my revenue change if I sell one more unit? How much does my marginal cost change if I produce one more unit? Over here, this marginal revenue product and this marginal factor cost, this is about one additional, additional resource, right? How much revenue is generated when I hire one more worker? Or how much revenue is generated when I hire or buy or rent one machine? How much does my cost for this resource change when I hire one more of it? So you cannot interchange marginal revenue with marginal revenue product because one is about the resource I'm hiring while the other is about the unit that I'm about to sell. So we have to be careful there. Now, the one that kind of spans both, I'm going to turn that into purple. The one that kind of spans both is the marginal product. I'm going to write this one out. That kind of, it goes both ways because we talk about a worker's diminishing marginal return, which is your marginal product. But that law of diminishing marginal return also impacts the marginal cost. Now, the big difference between MFC and MC is that this is for one resource, where the marginal cost over here is for everything put together. Can you guys think of anything else that kind of might confuse you between the two markets? That's a very good question, Camilla. Okay, so why is the marginal product for both? And the reason is because how each resources impact our production is going to impact the marginal cost. Because when I say, well, how much will it cost for me to produce the 100th unit? I have to look at all of the resources that I hired. How productive were they? Because their productivity impacts the cost that gets associated with that 100th unit. And their productivity is measured by the marginal product. So that's how it's tied to the product side. And we talked about the law of diminishing marginal returns. We talked a lot during multiple choice about the marginal cost, because remember, the marginal cost curve looks like this. Well, this portion right here, that is increasing returns. That's when the marginal product is increasing. Right? So the marginal product is going from 60 to 80 to 110. This portion over here, that is, sometimes they call it diminishing returns or decreasing returns. This is where our marginal product, and in both of these, our marginal product is positive, but the marginal product is decreasing. So this is how the marginal product is tied to the product market. When they talk about the diminishing marginal returns, sometimes you'll hear it described as it's when our production is increasing at a decreasing rate. So we're continuing to increase our production, but each time I add a worker, they're adding less and less. And then for Reese, the marginal product comes into play because of this marginal revenue product. That is correct. Somebody asked, is the marginal factor cost part of marginal cost? And the answer is yes, it is. So the marginal factor cost is us pulling apart the marginal cost into the different resources, different variable resources, because our fixed resources don't impact our marginal cost curve.